Okay, this is part two of the Weberianism essay. So in part two, I've already explained Weberianism in the first part, so I'm going to go on to Marxism, neo-Marxism and feminism in this part to criticise Weberianism. So Marxism emphasises the economic aspects of society, whereas Weber focuses on economic but also status and party dimensions of inequality. So the Marxists argue the Weberians present a trivial labour market analysis, which underplays economic ownership as the main factor in class, according to Marxists. So, for example, theorists have talked about how the top 10% in the class system have benefited, between the 80s and the current decades, due to their power based on economic wealth. So the top 10% own the largest proportion of total wealth, and this suggests a hardening of class inequalities rather than fragmentation. The Weberians are seen as overplaying fragmentation in the class system because they emphasise the labour market and ignore economic factors in terms of ownership. The neo-Marxists are in agreement with Weberian thinkers over the idea that social class inequality can be explained in terms of economic factors, but also cultural and social factors. Weber saw status as linked to position in the economy, but also based on independent factors of status. In other words, age, gender and ethnicity and race could affect status regardless of ownership and labour market position. And status could affect levels of ownership, and status can affect labour market position, independent of ownership and social background in terms of class. So the neo-Marxists agree with this view. They would see economic, cultural and social factors as important. They would agree with thinkers like Rex and Moore that racism is an issue in capitalism. However, whereas Rex and Moore as Weberians emphasise race will always affect identity and resources and life chances, independently of position in capitalism, the neo-Marxists would foreground capitalism, and they would say economic issues need to be focused on as the reason for racism. They would criticise the Weberians for overplaying the independence, the way in which status is independent of the economy, because the Weberians see economic, cultural and social factors as being independent. The feminists are, similarly to Weberian views, offer a conflict critical view. So again, they would support the idea that society is problematic, social inequality is problematic. However, they would foreground gender. So Weber tends to emphasise class most of all, in a similar way to Marxism, and ownership, whereas the feminists would say that gender and patriarchy came before class and came before capitalism, and therefore thinkers like Weberians tend to overemphasize class and ignore the way in which gender and patriarchy determine other forms of status. This is particularly important because the Weberians emphasize occupational status based on a measure of social class in terms of work and type of job, and this overplays the status of the head of the household in the public sphere of work and politics. The feminists would argue that it's important to take account of the personal sphere of the family and the household, and consider how this is also political, in the sense that there are power relationships and influence of different members of the family is very important. So Weberians are fundamentally seen as overemphasising the public sphere and ignoring the private sphere of the home and gender.